Welcome to Monk's Temple. Close your eyes for a moment. Not literally, you're reading, I understand. But imagine, just for a breath, that you could feel the exact weight of your own mortality resting in your palms like a small, smooth stone. Not heavy enough to crush you. Just heavy enough to remind you that you are holding something real. Now ask yourself, if you knew, with absolute certainty, that your life would end 7 days from today. Not from tragedy, not from violence, but simply because your time had arrived, would you spend those 7 days running? Would you try to outrun the stone? Would you hurl it into the ocean and pretend your hands were empty? Or would you, perhaps for the first time in your life, finally feel the true temperature of the air? Finally taste the salt of your own tears? Finally hold the people you love without the distraction of tomorrow? This is not a hypothetical game. This is not a philosophical riddle designed to pass a slow afternoon. This is the exact question that one of the most extraordinary human beings to ever walk the earth faced more than 2.5 millennia ago. And his answer did not just change his own death. It changed how millions of human beings have chosen to live, right up until this very moment you are breathing through. We are not here to rehearse a history lesson. We are here to sit at the foot of something far more intimate. We are here to understand, through the lens of psychology, through the framework of Buddhist wisdom, and through the quiet mirror of modern life, what it actually means to finish well. I am your guide for this journey. And you are not a passive listener. You are a participant in your own awakening. This is Monk's Temple. And this is not a story about how a man died. This is a story about how a life, fully lived, teaches us how to let go. There is a peculiar psychological phenomenon that occurs when human beings are confronted with the absolute certainty of an ending. It is not, as popular culture suggests, a sudden rush of adrenaline or a cinematic montage of one's life flashing before the eyes. No. What actually happens, according to the small but profound body of research on near-death awareness and terminal lucidity, is something far quieter. The mind, when it knows the door is closing, stops trying to furnish the room. We spend decades arranging furniture. We worry about the thread count of the curtains. We argue about where the sofa should face. We accumulate, we display, we polish, we protect. And then, one day, the awareness arrives, softly, without knocking, that the room itself is not permanent. Not the walls. Not the foundation. Not even the hands that arranged it all. Siddhartha Gautama, the man who would become the Buddha, did not discover this truth on his deathbed. He discovered it at 29, standing at the threshold of a palace, staring at 3 faces he had never been permitted to see: sickness, aging, and death. Most of us spend our entire lives trying to unsee those faces. We turn away. We build higher walls. We pretend the stone in our hands is actually a flower. The Buddha did something radically different. He walked toward the faces. He sat down in their presence. And he did not leave until he understood that the stone was not his enemy. It was his teacher. This is where our story must begin, not with the final breath, but with the first recognition. Because the way the Buddha died was not a separate event from the way he lived. It was the culmination of 45 years of daily, moment-by-moment practice in the art of meeting reality exactly as it is, without flinching, without embellishment, and without escape. If we want to understand his final words, all conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. we must first understand that he was not delivering a eulogy for himself. He was offering a mirror. And that mirror, if we are brave enough to hold it, reflects not a man from 483 BCE, but the face we see every morning in our own bathroom mirror, toothpaste on the chin, coffee brewing, thinking about the emails we haven't answered. The invitation arrives uninvited. The question is never whether it will come. The question is whether, when it arrives, we will be home to receive it. In a small village in northern India, not far from the route the Buddha would one day walk, there lived an elderly potter named Chandaka. He had been shaping clay since he was 7 years old. His hands knew the wheel the way a river knows its banks. He could close his eyes and tell you, by the moisture between his fingers, whether a vessel would hold water or wine. One afternoon, a young monk traveling through the region stopped to rest in Chandaka's workshop. The monk watched the old man work in silence for nearly an hour. Finally, he spoke. "Venerable potter," the monk said, "I have studied the teachings of the Buddha for 12 years. I have memorized thousands of sutras. I have sat in meditation for days without moving. Yet when I look at your hands, I see something I do not possess." Chandaka did not stop turning the wheel. He did not look up. His voice was soft, like damp clay. "What do you see?" he asked. "Peace," the monk said. "Not the peace of withdrawal. The peace of engagement. You are not escaping the clay. You are becoming it." Chandaka smiled. He lifted a freshly shaped bowl from the wheel and placed it on the wooden shelf beside him. Then he picked up another lump of clay, wet his hands, and began again. "When I was a young man," Chandaka said, "I dropped a finished pot. It was beautiful. I had spent 3 days on it. It hit the stone floor and shattered into 17 pieces. I wept for an hour. My teacher, an old potter named Sujata, picked up one of the shards and held it to the light. He said, 'This crack was already in the pot the moment you began. You simply could not see it yet.'" The monk was silent. Chandaka continued. "I did not understand him then. I thought he meant the pot was flawed from the beginning. But now, 83 years into this body, I understand. Everything we make is already broken. Everything we love is already leaving. The crack is not a failure of the potter. The crack is the signature of time itself." He paused, adjusting the wheel's speed. "The Buddha did not teach me how to make pots that never break," Chandaka said. "He taught me how to honor the clay while it is still in my hands. That is the only potter's secret there is." The monk bowed his head. He stayed in the village for 3 months, learning not sutras, but clay. By the time he left, his hands had begun to remember what his mind had forgotten. This is the first teaching of the Buddha's final days, though it does not appear in any sutra. Death is not an interruption of life. It is the completion of a shape, ****. A pot does not shatter because the potter failed. A pot shatters because it was never meant to be permanent. The potter's art is not in preventing the crack. The potter's art is in forming something so true to its nature that when it breaks, the pieces themselves are beautiful. The Buddha's body broke. He did not mourn it. He had spent 80 years forming something far more enduring than flesh. If the story of the potter and the crack has touched something in you, if you recognize, even faintly, that you too have been trying to make unbreakable pots in a world of inevitable shattering, then you have already begun the journey. This is what Monk's Temple exists for, not to give you answers you can memorize, but to offer you mirrors you can recognize. Please consider subscribing. Not as a transaction. Not as a favor to us. But as a commitment to yourself, a small, daily reminder that you are willing to sit with the clay, even knowing it will one day crack. We release teachings like this every week. Not lectures. Not sermons. Just honest conversations about what it means to be human, held in the light of ancient wisdom and modern psychology. If that matters to you, press subscribe. And if you know someone who is trying too hard to hold together what was never meant to be permanent, share this with them. Sometimes the greatest kindness we can offer is to show another person that their cracks are not failures, they are signatures. Now, let us continue. Modern psychology has a name for what the Buddha spent 45 years dismantling. We call it the attachment system. It is not a metaphor. It is not a spiritual concept. It is a neurobiological reality, mapped in the ventral striatum, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the intricate dopamine pathways that evolved to keep us seeking, acquiring, and clutching. The Buddha called it upadana. It means, literally, fuel. Not the flame itself, the fuel that feeds the flame. Every time we grasp at a person, a possession, a status, an identity, we are tossing another log onto a fire that will never be satisfied. The flame does not say, "Thank you, I have enough." The flame says, "More." This is not a moral failing. It is not a sin. It is a design feature. Our brains evolved in environments of scarcity, where the individual who clutched the most food, the most secure shelter, the most reliable social alliances, was the individual who survived to pass on their genes. The attachment system is not broken. It is simply, in the context of modern life, deeply confused. We are clutching at ghosts. We are building fortresses around sand. We are arranging furniture in a room that was never ours to keep. The Buddha, in his final weeks, did not suddenly become free of attachment. He had been free for 45 years. What he did in those final days was demonstrate, with surgical precision, what freedom actually looks like when it meets the ultimate object of attachment, the self. Consider the moment when his devoted disciple Ananda, overwhelmed with grief, stepped away from the group and leaned against the doorframe of the hut where the Buddha rested. Ananda had been with the Buddha for 25 years. He had memorized every discourse. He had anticipated every need. He had loved his teacher not as a distant master, but as a father, a brother, a friend. And now that father was leaving. The Buddha, though weakened, noticed Ananda's absence. He called him back. What happened next is not a lecture. It is a masterclass in the psychology of grief. The Buddha did not say, "Ananda, you should not be attached." He did not quote scripture. He did not remind Ananda of impermanence as if it were a fact to be memorized rather than a truth to be integrated. Instead, the Buddha praised him. He listed Ananda's years of service with specific, tender detail. He acknowledged the love. He validated the grief. And then, in the same breath, he planted a seed, do not let sorrow cloud your mind. The time for your own awakening is near, This is the architecture of healthy detachment. It does not bypass love. It transmutes love from a chain into a wing. In the ancient city of Taxila, long after the Buddha's passing, there lived a monk named Dhammakita who had dedicated his entire monastic life to the preservation of the Buddha's words. He was not a teacher. He was not a meditator. He was an archivist. His fingers, stained permanently with ink, had copied the entire Sutta Pitaka by hand, twice. His cell contained no decorations, no luxuries, no personal belongings except for palm leaf manuscripts stacked to the ceiling. He slept on a mat no thicker than his own palm. He ate one meal a day. His entire existence was organized around a singular mission of ensuring that not a single syllable of the Buddha's teachings would be lost to time. One evening, a fire broke out in the neighboring village. The wind carried embers across the fields, and within an hour, the monastery was burning. Monks ran in every direction, carrying water buckets, rescuing robes, herding novices to safety. But Dhammarakita did not run. He stood at the entrance of his cell, staring at the manuscripts. He could only carry one armful. There were thousands. A younger monk, Samgasena, grabbed his arm. "Venerable, you must leave. The roof will collapse." Dhammarakita did not move. His voice was barely audible. "I have spent 40 years preserving his words," he said. "And now I do not know which words to save." Samgasena looked at the flames, then back at the old monk. He did not pull harder. He released his grip. "Venerable," he said, "what did the Buddha teach about fire?" Dhammarakita closed his eyes. His lips moved silently. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the cell, leaving every manuscript behind. They sat together on the hill overlooking the burning monastery. Samgasena expected tears, or at least silence. Instead, Dhammarakita began to laugh, softly at first, then with a release that shook his thin shoulders. 40 years, he said. I thought I was preserving his words. But his words were never in the ink. His words were in the fire. He looked at the younger monk. The Buddha taught that all conditioned things are subject to decay. Did he make an exception for his own teachings? Samgasena shook his head. Then why, Dhammarakita whispered, did I believe that my copies would last forever? He never copied another manuscript. For the remaining 12 years of his life, he taught the children of Taxila to read, not Buddhist texts, but anything. Letters home. Market receipts. Love poems. When other monks criticized him for abandoning the Dharma, he smiled and said nothing. On the night he died, his students found him sitting under a banyan tree, a half-finished alphabet tablet on his lap. His fingers were still stained with ink. The archivist's attachment was not to the Buddha. It was to the representation of the Buddha. And this is the most subtle form of grasping, the belief that if we can just hold the map tightly enough, we will never have to walk the terrain. The Buddha's final journey was a deliberate undoing of this illusion. He did not appoint a successor. He did not write down a single word. He did not establish a papal lineage. He placed the entire weight of his legacy not on institutions, not on texts, not on relics, but on the living practice of ordinary human beings, each of whom would have to discover the Dharma for themselves, in their own language, in their own century, with their own cracked hands. This is not abandonment. This is the ultimate act of trust. Let us now approach the controversy that has followed the Buddha's final days like a persistent shadow. The meal. The offering. The illness. The whispers of poison. There is a reason this question has persisted for 25 centuries, and it is not, as some scholars suggest, merely a matter of textual ambiguity. The question of whether the Buddha was poisoned is compelling because it is psychological. It speaks to our deep discomfort with the ordinariness of death. We want the Buddha's death to be dramatic. We want it to be meaningful. We want it to be the result of something: betrayal, conspiracy, cosmic significance. What we do not want is for the Buddha to have died simply because he was 80 years old, his body worn out from 45 years of walking across northern India on unpaved roads, eating whatever was offered, sleeping on the ground, teaching until his voice gave out. This is the same discomfort we feel when a beloved grandparent dies quietly in their sleep. We search for a story. Asterisk: was it the medication? Did the doctor miss something? Should we have visited more often? Asterisk: anything is easier to bear than the simple, unglamorous truth: they were old, and old bodies stop. The Buddha's final meal was offered by a metalworker named Kunda. This is important. Kunda was not wealthy. He was not a king or a merchant prince. He was a craftsman, a man of modest means, who offered the most generous hospitality he could afford. The exact nature of the dish, *sukramadava*, remains linguistically ambiguous. It may have been a type of wild boar. It may have been a truffle-like fungus. It may have been a delicacy reserved for special guests. What is not ambiguous is the Buddha's response. After eating, the Buddha became ill. He experienced severe dysentery. His body, already fragile, began to fail more rapidly. Yet when Ananda, in distress, began to formulate a public apology to Kunda, fearing that the metalworker would be blamed for the Buddha's death, the Buddha stopped him immediately. "Ananda," he said, "there are two offerings of food that are of equal merit, equal result, equal fruition. One is the meal before a Buddha's enlightenment. The other is the meal before a Buddha's final nibbana. Kunda has accumulated great merit. Let no one blame him. Let no one regret his generosity. This is not the response of a man who believes he has been poisoned. This is the response of a man who understands that death is not a punishment, and that the final act of receiving is itself a teaching." In the kingdom of Kosala, many centuries after the Buddha's passing, there lived a royal cook named Sumana who was renowned throughout the region for his curries. It was said that King Pasenadi, who had been a contemporary of the Buddha, once offered Sumana an entire village in exchange for the recipe for his eggplant curry. Sumana refused. "Your Majesty," he said, "a recipe is not a thing that can be given. It is a relationship between the cook, the ingredients, and the moment. If I write it down, it becomes a different dish." The king, frustrated but intrigued, invited the Buddha, not the historical Buddha, but a senior monk from the nearby monastery, to adjudicate the dispute. The monk listened carefully to both sides. Then he asked Sumana a single question. "Cook, when you prepare a meal for the king, do you taste it before it is served?" Sumana nodded. "Of course, Venerable. It is my duty to ensure it is perfect." "And when you taste it," the monk continued, "do you taste the king's meal or your own?" Sumana was silent for a long time. Then he bowed. "I understand, Venerable. I have been tasting my own reputation, not the food." The monk smiled. The Buddha taught that there are three kinds of offering. The first is offered with expectation. The second is offered with duty. The third is offered with nothing added, no hope, no fear, no recipe. This third offering cannot be stolen, cannot be copied, and cannot be regretted. Sumana returned to his kitchen. He never again refused to share a recipe. He had finally understood that the eggplant curry had never belonged to him in the first place. Kunda's offering to the Buddha was the third kind. It was offered with nothing added. No expectation of reward. No fear of inadequacy. No recipe for how it should be received. Kunda simply offered what he had, when it was requested, with the same hands that shaped metal into vessels for cooking. And the Buddha received it the same way, with nothing added. No suspicion. No regret. No calculation of whether this meal would extend or shorten his life. He was hungry, so he ate. He was offered, so he received. The illness that followed was not a punishment for Kunda's generosity or a failure of the Buddha's discernment. It was simply the next moment in a life that had never been about the preservation of the body. We spend so much energy trying to control what enters us. We curate our diets. We read ingredient labels. We fear contamination, physical, spiritual, emotional. And yet the Buddha, in his final hours, demonstrates a radically different relationship to consumption. He does not ask what is in the bowl. He asks only whether it is offered with sincerity. This is not negligence. This is trust in the fundamental goodness of receiving. It is the recognition that we are not separate from what enters us, we are the process of entering itself. One of the most psychologically intriguing aspects of the Buddha's final days is his apparent foreknowledge of death. According to the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha explicitly declared to Ananda, 3 months before his passing, that he would die at Kushinagar. He did not speak in vague metaphors. He did not say, "I am old and my body is tired." He made a specific, verifiable prediction. Modern psychology has a term for this kind of awareness. We call it terminal lucidity, a phenomenon, documented in hundreds of case studies, in which individuals with severe dementia or terminal illness suddenly, shortly before death, exhibit remarkable clarity of mind, memory, and communication. It is as if the brain, in its final hours, gathers all its remaining resources for one last act of coherent self-expression. But the Buddha's foreknowledge was not sudden. It was sustained over 3 months. He did not experience a brief window of clarity, he inhabited a prolonged state of conscious, deliberate preparation. This is not terminal lucidity. This is something far more rare, far more difficult, and far more instructive. This is integrated awareness. Integrated awareness is not the ability to predict the future. It is the ability to recognize, with increasing precision, the trajectory of the present. The Buddha did not need supernatural powers to know he would die in Kushinagar. He needed only to observe his own body, his own energy, his own circumstances, and extrapolate honestly. He was 80 years old. He was ill. He was walking north. He was not planning to stop walking until his body stopped carrying him. Kushinagar was not a prophecy. It was a recognition. In the coastal city of Barakacha, there lived a cartographer named Jataka who had spent his entire career mapping lands he had never visited. He sat in a high tower overlooking the harbor, interviewing sailors, merchants, and pilgrims, compiling their descriptions into increasingly detailed maps of the known world. His maps were famous throughout Jambudvipa. Kings consulted him before military campaigns. Merchants paid him in gold for trade route charts. Pilgrims carried his folded parchments across deserts and mountain passes. And yet Jataka himself had never left Barakacha. His legs, crippled from childhood illness, could not carry him beyond the city gates. One evening, a Buddhist nun named Dhammadinna came to the tower seeking directions to a remote pilgrimage site. Jataka unrolled his most detailed map of the region and traced the route with his finger. Dhammadinna listened patiently, then asked a question that stopped him mid-sentence. "Master cartographer," she said, "have you ever felt the dust of that road under your feet?" Jataka's hand froze. He looked at his finger, still resting on the parchment. "No," he said quietly. "I have not." "Then how," Dhammadinna asked, "do you know where the road ends?" Jataka did not answer. He rolled up the map and set it aside. For the first time in 40 years, he did not work through the night. The next morning, he asked to be carried to the monastery. He requested ordination not as a monk, his body could not sustain the austerities, but as a lay practitioner with a single commitment: he would draw no more maps. When Dhammadinna visited him months later, she found him sitting in the monastery courtyard, watching ants carry crumbs across the stone tiles. He smiled when he saw her. "I have been studying 1 square foot of earth for 3 months, he said. "I have never been less certain of where anything is. And I have never been less lost." The Buddha's foreknowledge of his death was not a map. It was a relationship. He did not predict his death the way a cartographer predicts the coastline. He recognized his death the way a river recognizes the ocean. Not because it has seen the ocean, but because it can feel the increasing salt in its current, the slowing of its pace, the widening of its banks. This is the psychological skill the Buddha cultivated for 45 years, and it is available to every human being who is willing to practice it. It is not morbid. It is not depressive. It is the most life-affirming orientation possible, because it liberates us from the exhausting pretense that we are permanent fixtures in a permanent world. When you know the road ends, you stop checking the map and start feeling the dust under your feet. Let us now arrive at Kushinagar. Not as tourists visiting a historical site, but as participants in a psychological event. The Buddha chose to die between 2 sal trees. This is not incidental. Sal trees are not particularly remarkable. They are neither the tallest nor the most ancient nor the most sacred of Indian trees. They are ordinary. They flower seasonally. They provide timber and shade. They are, in every sense, unextraordinary. And that is precisely why the Buddha chose them. A less enlightened teacher might have demanded a grander setting. A throne. A temple. A mountain peak. A congregation of thousands. But the Buddha, in his final act of pedagogy, chose ordinariness. He lay down on the ground, between 2 common trees, in a small town that no one had ever heard of, and would never have remembered if not for this moment. The sal trees, according to the account, burst into unseasonal bloom. Petals drifted down onto the Buddha's body. This is often interpreted as a miracle, a supernatural sign of the Buddha's significance. But there is another interpretation, more psychologically nuanced and far more instructive. The sal trees did not bloom because the Buddha was special. The sal trees bloomed because the Buddha, in his final moments, was paying attention. We are surrounded by unseasonal blooms every day. Sunlight through a window at exactly the right angle. The sound of a child's laughter from a passing car. The scent of rain on dry concrete. These moments are not rare. Our attention to them is. The Buddha did not die in a barren wasteland that suddenly flowered to honor him. He died in a grove that was already flowering, and he was the only one present who noticed. In the centuries following the Buddha's death, the Emperor Ashoka undertook a pilgrimage to all the significant sites of the Buddha's life. He traveled with an entourage of thousands, soldiers, ministers, monks, architects. Wherever the Buddha had stood, Ashoka built a monument. Wherever the Buddha had sat, Ashoka erected a pillar. When he arrived at Kushinagar, he found the sal grove overgrown and neglected. The local villagers, who had maintained the site for generations, had been displaced by wars and famines. Only one elderly gardener remained, a man named Nagasena, who tended the trees not for pilgrims or profit, but because his grandfather had tended them, and his grandfather's grandfather before him. Ashoka's architects immediately began planning a grand stupa to mark the site of the Buddha's passing. They measured the ground. They drew blueprints. They calculated how many bricks would be required. Nagasena watched them for 3 days. On the 4th morning, he approached the emperor. "Your Majesty," he said, "may I show you something?" Ashoka, impressed by the old man's fearlessness, agreed. Nagasena led him to a single sal tree at the edge of the grove. He pointed to a small, almost invisible scar on the trunk. "My grandfather made this mark," Nagasena said. "He said it was the tree that showered petals on the Blessed One. He showed it to my father, and my father showed it to me." Ashoka examined the scar. It was unremarkable, the kind of mark a falling branch might leave, or a foraging animal. "How do you know this is the true tree?" Ashoka asked. "There are hundreds here. After 2 centuries, how can anyone be certain?" Nagasena smiled. He placed his weathered hand on the trunk. "I am not certain, Your Majesty. My grandfather was not certain. But he came here every morning of his life, and every morning he watered this tree first. Not because he knew it was the true tree. Because he knew that certainty was not the point." Ashoka was silent for a long time. Then he turned to his architects. "Build the stupa over there," he said, pointing to an empty field. "Leave the grove as it is." He visited Nagasena every day for the remaining 2 weeks of his stay. They did not speak of the Buddha. They spoke of soil, water, and the patience of roots. The Buddha's final resting place was not made sacred by Ashoka's stupa. It was made sacred by Nagasena's grandfather, who watered a tree he could not be certain of, and by Nagasena himself, who understood that the teaching was not in the identification of the tree, but in the act of watering. This is the psychological equivalent of the sal trees blooming in unseasonal time. We do not need to wait for extraordinary moments to arrive. We need only to recognize the extraordinary that is already here, disguised as ordinary, blooming without our permission. There is a detail in the accounts of the Buddha's final hours that is easy to overlook, buried as it is between the more dramatic events of the meal and the passing. It is the story of Subhata. Subhata was a wanderer, an ascetic of a different sect, who heard that the Buddha was dying and rushed to Kushinagar to have his final questions answered. Ananda, protective and grieving, tried to turn him away. "The Blessed One is weary," Ananda said. "Do not disturb him." But the Buddha overheard. His body was failing, his breath shallow, his time measured in minutes. And yet he said, "Let him come. He asks for enlightenment, not trouble." Subhata approached. He asked his questions. The Buddha answered. And before the Buddha drew his final breath, Subhata became his last direct disciple, ordained, awakened, transformed. This is, psychologically speaking, one of the most remarkable moments in the entire canon. The Buddha did not conserve his remaining energy for himself. He did not use his final moments for personal reflection, preparation, or closure. He used them for one more act of teaching, one more act of conversion, one more act of connection. This is the opposite of how we typically approach endings. We withdraw. We conserve. We protect our remaining time as if it were a finite resource to be hoarded rather than a final opportunity to be spent. The Buddha spent his last coins on a stranger. In the monastic university of Nalanda, centuries after the Buddha, there lived a renowned teacher named Aryadeva who had never refused a student. Not once. In 43 years of teaching, he had accepted every person who came to his door, regardless of their background, motivation, or capacity. His colleagues considered this a form of weakness. You waste your time on fools and merchants, they said. You should conserve your energy for those who can actually understand. Aryadeva did not argue. He simply continued accepting everyone. In his 79th year, Aryadeva fell gravely ill. His voice weakened. His breath shortened. His body, once capable of lecturing for 12 hours, could now barely sustain a single sentence. His attendant monks, hoping to protect their teacher's remaining strength, began turning students away. Aryadeva noticed. He called his attendant to his bedside. Who came today? He asked. The attendant hesitated. A farmer, venerable. His wife had died. He wanted to know how to grieve. What did you tell him? I told him you were too ill to see him. Aryadeva closed his eyes. His breathing was labored. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. Bring him back. The attendant protested. Venerable, you can barely speak. What can you possibly offer him? Aryadeva opened his eyes. He looked at his attendant with the same patient compassion he had offered every student for 43 years. Everything I have left, he said. The farmer returned. Aryadeva spoke to him for 45 minutes. His voice broke. He coughed blood. But he answered every question, addressed every doubt, acknowledged every tear. The farmer left not enlightened, but changed. He had been met in his grief by someone who had nothing left to protect. Aryadeva died 3 days later. His attendant, who had tried to protect him, never forgave himself. But Aryadeva, in his final teaching, had already forgiven him, not with words, but with the undeniable example of a life that spent every last coin on strangers. This is the psychological mechanism of generosity that the Buddha modeled until his final breath. It is not about the magnitude of the gift. It is about the completeness of the giving. A gift given with one hand while the other hand holds something back is not a gift, it is a negotiation. A gift given with both hands, empty of expectation, empty of self-preservation, empty of tomorrow, that is the gift that transforms both giver and receiver. Subhata came to the Buddha seeking answers. He received something far more valuable. He received the Buddha's complete, undivided presence in a moment when the Buddha had every excuse to withhold it. And that presence, that willingness to spend his last minutes on a stranger, was itself the answer to every question Subhata had ever carried. We arrive now at the words themselves. Not as a historical quotation to be memorized, but as a psychological prescription to be filled. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. The Buddha did not invent the first sentence. Every human being, in every culture, in every century, has known this truth at some level. We know our bodies will age. We know our loved ones will die. We know our achievements will be forgotten. We know this so deeply and so painfully that we have developed an entire civilization dedicated to the art of not knowing it. The Buddha's innovation was not in the diagnosis. It was in the prescription. Strive on with diligence. Not resign yourself. Not withdraw from the world. Not wait patiently for death. Strive on with diligence. This is not the language of passivity. This is the language of a personal trainer. This is the language of a coach at halftime, down by 20 points, telling his team that the game is not over until the final whistle. This is the language of a physician who has just delivered terminal news and then says, "Now, here is how we will spend the time remaining." The Buddha's last words are not a eulogy. They are a battle cry. In the city of Savatthi, during the time of the Buddha, there lived a physician named Javaka who had dedicated his life to healing the sick. He had been the Buddha's personal doctor for many years and had treated countless monks, nuns, and lay people without accepting payment. In his old age, Javaka developed a tremor in his hands. At first it was barely noticeable, but over time it worsened until he could no longer perform surgery, no longer prepare medicines, no longer even hold a bowl steady. His students urged him to retire. "You have earned rest," they said. "You have healed thousands. Let us carry your legacy." Javaka refused. He continued coming to the monastery infirmary every morning, even though he could no longer treat patients. He sat in the corner, observing, offering quiet suggestions, holding the hands of the dying. One of his students, frustrated by what he perceived as stubbornness, confronted him. "Teacher, why do you stay? You are no longer a physician. Your hands are useless." Javaka looked at his trembling hands. They had delivered 10,000 babies. They had set 1,000 broken bones. They had closed the eyes of the Buddha himself. "You are right," Javaka said. "My hands are useless. But I was never only a physician. I was a witness. And a witness does not need hands." He continued sitting in the infirmary corner until the day he died, 3 months later. His last act was not a surgery or a prescription. His last act was to hold the hand of a young mother dying of fever, his trembling fingers wrapped around hers, his presence the only medicine he had left to offer. When she asked him, "Am I going to die?" he did not lie and he did not look away. "Yes," he said. "We all are. And until that moment, I will be here." She died at dawn. Javaka died that evening. His students, who had spent years trying to cure his tremor, finally understood that he had not been waiting for his hands to heal. He had been waiting for his last patient. Strive on with diligence. This is not a command to achieve more, acquire more, accomplish more. Javaka's final months were not productive by any measurable standard. He did not heal anyone. He did not train anyone. He did not leave behind a single new medical text. But he was present. He witnessed. He held hands. He did not withdraw from the suffering of the world simply because he could no longer cure it. He stayed in the infirmary, in the presence of pain, because that is what diligence looks like when achievement is no longer possible. The Buddha's final words are not a productivity hack. They are a radical redefinition of what it means to strive. Striving is not always doing. Sometimes striving is staying. Sometimes striving is sitting. Sometimes striving is the simple, heroic act of not leaving the room before your presence is no longer needed. The accounts of the Buddha's cremation contain a detail that is almost never discussed, overshadowed as it is by the more dramatic events of his passing. The Buddha, before his death, gave specific instructions regarding his remains. He told Ananda that his body should be treated like the remains of a universal monarch. Wrapped in fresh cloth, placed in an iron vessel filled with oil, covered with another iron vessel, and cremated on a pyre of fragrant woods. This is, on its surface, a surprising instruction. The man who had spent 45 years teaching non-attachment to material things, who had refused to appoint a successor, who had placed no value on relics or monuments, why would he concern himself with the details of his own cremation? The answer, psychologically speaking, is not about the Buddha's attachment to his body. It is about the attachment of his followers. The Buddha understood that grief requires ritual. He understood that the human heart, no matter how enlightened, needs containers for its sorrow. He understood that his disciples, in the immediate aftermath of his death, would be lost without something to do, something to touch, something to carry. So he gave them a funeral. Not because he needed one. Because they did. In a small fishing village on the banks of the Ganges, there lived a carpenter named Madika who had never crossed the river. He had spent his entire life building boats for others, sturdy vessels capable of carrying passengers, livestock, and merchandise to the far shore. But Madika himself remained on the near shore, hammer in hand, watching his boats disappear into the morning mist. His neighbors found this inexplicable. "Master Carpenter," they said, "you have built 1,000 boats. Why have you never sailed in one?" Madika did not answer. He continued shaping wood, fitting planks, sealing seams. When he was 72 years old, Madika fell ill. His hands, worn smooth by decades of handling timber, could no longer hold a chisel. His students gathered at his bedside, grieving not only their teacher but the boats he would never build again. On his final day, Madika called his eldest student to his side. "Under my workbench," he whispered, "you will find a small box. Bring it to me." The student retrieved the box and opened it. Inside was a single, unfinished boat model, no larger than his palm, carved from a piece of driftwood so weathered that its origin was unrecognizable. "I found this on the riverbank when I was 7 years old," Madika said. "It was already old then. I do not know who carved it, or what boat it was meant to be, or why it was never completed. I have kept it under my bench for 65 years. He placed the small carving in his student's hands. "I never crossed the river," Madika said, "because I understood that the boats were never mine. They were always for the people who needed to reach the far shore. This boat, this unfinished, unnamed, unclaimed boat, it was the only one I ever built for myself." He closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. His students, weeping, did not know what to do with the small carving in their hands. Then the eldest student stood. He walked to the riverbank, the unfinished boat cradled in his palms. He knelt. He placed the carving on the surface of the water. It floated for a moment, spinning slowly in the current. Then it drifted away, smaller and smaller, until it was indistinguishable from the morning mist. The Buddha's funeral instructions were his unfinished boat. He did not need a pyre of fragrant woods. He did not need fresh cloth and iron vessels. He did not need his ashes divided and enshrined in stupas across the subcontinent. But his disciples did. And so he gave them a boat to carry his memory across the river of their grief. Not because the boat was permanent, all boats are subject to decay, but because the act of building, launching, and releasing is itself the crossing. We do not honor the dead by preserving their boats. We honor them by building boats for those who still wait on the near shore. The division of the Buddha's relics is one of the most historically documented events in early Buddhism. 8 kingdoms claimed his remains. A Brahmin named Dona mediated the dispute, dividing the ashes into 8 portions and distributing them among the claimants. The vessel itself was given to Dona, and the embers of the pyre were claimed by a 9th party. Within centuries, these relics were enshrined in stupas across Asia. They were worshipped, venerated, carried in procession, buried under monuments, lost, rediscovered, and enshrined again. Today, fragments of the Buddha's bones reside in museums, monasteries, and private collections on multiple continents. This is, from a certain perspective, the ultimate irony. The man who taught that all conditioned things are subject to decay has had his physical remains preserved, protected, and pursued for 25 centuries. The man who rejected attachment to material forms has become the object of material devotion on a global scale. But from a psychological perspective, this is not irony at all. It is the natural, necessary expression of how human beings process the loss of those we love. We keep photographs. We preserve clothing. We visit graves. We argue over who inherits the silver. These acts are not failures of non-attachment. They are the ordinary, tender, clumsy ways we continue to hold those who have slipped beyond our reach. The Buddha knew this. He did not forbid the veneration of relics. He did not instruct his followers to cremate his body and scatter the ashes in an unmarked location. He allowed them to hold what they could not keep. This is not a compromise of his teachings. It is the ultimate expression of his compassion. In the 20th century, long after the great Buddhist kingdoms had fallen, a Thai monk named Ajahn Chah was offered a small fragment of what was believed to be the Buddha's bone. It had been passed down through generations of monks, hidden during wars, smuggled across borders, and finally entrusted to Ajahn Chah's monastery by an elderly abbot who had carried it in a leather pouch around his neck for 40 years. The monks gathered to witness the installation of this precious relic. They built a small crystal stupa. They prepared offerings of incense and flowers. They chanted throughout the night. Ajahn Chah watched all of this without comment. In the morning, he asked to see the relic. The monks brought it to him reverently, holding the crystal stupa with both hands. Ajahn Chah opened a small compartment and tipped the fragment of bone into his palm. It was no larger than a grain of rice. It was yellowed with age, smooth from centuries of handling. It looked, more than anything else, like a small pebble from a riverbed. Ajahn Chah held it up to the light. He turned it over in his weathered fingers. He examined it with the same attention he gave to a fallen leaf, a drinking cup, a mosquito on his arm. Then he placed it back in the crystal stupa and handed it to the monks. "Is it real?" they asked. "Is it truly the Buddha's bone?" Ajahn Chah smiled. He picked up a fallen twig from the monastery path and held it beside the crystal stupa. "This twig was once part of a tree," he said. "The tree was once a seed. The seed came from another tree. If I follow this twig backward through time, where does it end? At what point does a twig become not a twig?" The monks were silent. The Buddha said, "All conditioned things are subject to decay," Ajahn Chah continued. He did not say, "Except my bones." This fragment has been decaying for 25 centuries. It will continue decaying until it is indistinguishable from the soil that holds this monastery. And the soil will decay, and the monastery, and the monks who venerate it. He placed the twig beside the stupa. But the teaching that conditioned things decay, that teaching does not decay. Not because it is permanent. Because it is true. And truth is not a thing. Truth is the relationship between a thing and the mind that perceives it. He looked at the monks with the same patient compassion he had offered thousands of students. Venerate the bone if it helps you remember impermanence. But do not mistake the bone for the teaching. The bone will turn to dust. The teaching will turn your dust into awareness. The relics of the Buddha are not the Buddha. The teachings of the Buddha are not the Buddha. The institutions that carry his name are not the Buddha. The Buddha was a conditioned thing, subject to decay, and he decayed exactly as he taught he would. What remains is not a collection of objects. What remains is a relationship between the truth he recognized and the minds that continue to recognize it. This relationship does not decay, not because it is permanent, but because it is continuously renewed. Every time a human being looks at their own mortality and does not flinch, the Buddha dies again. Every time a human being receives what is offered without adding expectation or regret, the Buddha eats his last meal. Every time a human being spends their final coins on a stranger, the Buddha teaches Subhata. The relics are not in the stupas. The relics are in the relationship. We began with a question: if you knew, with absolute certainty, that your life would end 7 days from today, would you spend those 7 days running, or would you finally feel the temperature of the air? This is not a hypothetical. This is not a philosophical riddle. This is the question the Buddha spent 45 years answering, and his answer was not a set of propositions but a demonstration. He did not run. He did not hide. He did not pretend the stone in his hands was a flower. He received his death the same way he received his breakfast, as an ordinary, inevitable, unremarkable moment in a life that had never been about the preservation of the self. And then he did something extraordinary. He used his death as a teaching. Not a dramatic teaching, no thunderbolts, no parting of the heavens, no angels descending on chariots of fire. Just a quiet instruction, delivered between two ordinary trees, to a small group of grieving friends. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. This is the invitation extended to every human being who has ever lived. Not to become Buddhist. Not to memorize sutras. not to meditate for hours in uncomfortable postures, but to recognize, with increasing clarity, that the stone in your hands is not your enemy. It is your teacher. And the only question that matters is whether you are willing to sit in its presence long enough to learn what it has to teach. The Buddha's final journey did not end at Kushinagar. It continues in every moment of genuine presence, every act of complete generosity, every refusal to flee from the truth of impermanence. The Buddha did not die. The Buddha awakened. An awakening, unlike dying, is not a single event. It is an ongoing relationship with reality as it actually is, not as we wish it to be. You are, at this very moment, holding the stone. You have always been holding it. You have simply been too distracted by the arrangement of furniture to notice its weight in your palm. The Buddha's final teaching is not a command to drop the stone. It is an invitation to feel it. To recognize its temperature, its texture, its undeniable reality. To stop pretending that your hands are empty when they are, and have always been, full. All conditioned things are subject to decay. This is not bad news. It is the news. And like all news, its power is not in its content but in our willingness to receive it. Strive on with diligence. This is not a burden. It is a liberation. It is permission to stop running, stop hiding, stop pretending. It is permission to spend your remaining coins on strangers, to water trees you cannot be certain of, to sit in infirmaries when your hands are no longer useful. It is permission to live, fully and completely, in the only moment that has ever been available to you. This moment. This breath. This stone, held in these hands, at this exact intersection of time and awareness. Welcome to Monk's Temple. You have always been here.